I don't ask myself what I'm looking for. I didn't come for answers to a place like this. I came to walk on the earth, still cold, still silent, still ungiving, I've said to myself. Although it greets me with last year's dead thistles and this year's hard spines, early blooming wild onions, the curling remains of spider's claw. What did I bring to the dance? In my back pocket, a crushed letter from a woman I've never met, bearing bad news I can do nothing about. So I wander these woods half sightless, while a west wind picks up in the trees, clustered above. The pines make a music like no other, rising and falling like a distant surf at night that calms the darkness before first light. Soughing, we call it, from Old English, no less. How weightless words are when nothing will do.
Welcome. I'm Saul Jimenez-Sandoval. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities. It's truly an honor to have all of you here. It's a momentous day, a perfect day otherwise. Poets present, poetry flowing in the air. It's a celebration of Phil Levine's poetry, of his legacy, of his memory, of his life, the relationships he built around you, around this society, around our valley. He every day was present in his life. He every day was present in his poetry. And he helped us discover the jewels that make us the humans that we are. As Poet Laureate and Professor Emeritus, Phil Levine is fundamental to our college. He is the cornerstone of our humanity and of our artistry. This is a celebration of his life and his gifts of vision, wit, and of course, humor. And in this celebration, there are key people who sustained his love of life and words. Fran, his wife. And his 3 sons, Mark, John, and Ted. We are here to celebrate the poet who, in his words, quote, absurd fragments of eternity in the ordinary. It's so beautiful, it's so warming. Now it's my privilege to welcome Provost Lynnette Zelezny. It was the resourcefulness and vision of the Provost that put this event in motion. It was her support that has been instrumental in making this event a reality. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Dean Jimenez-Sandoval. Very kind introduction. On behalf of President Joseph Castro and his wife Mary Castro, it is such an honor to be here today to welcome all of you and to celebrate Philip Levine's extraordinary life. I'm delighted to see so many distinguished guests and friends. I want to thank especially the planning committee for all their hard work in making today happen, especially Dr. Connie Hales from the English Department, Professor Emeriti Linnette Alexander, Chuck Hanzlicek, Peter Everwine, Special Assistant to the Provost, Jose Diaz, Interior Design Faculty Member Imelda Golick. Will you give them a round of applause? I too want to acknowledge Philip Levine's family, especially Fran, his beautiful sons. Thank you for sharing Philip with all of us, and thank you for all of the contributions that you have made to Fresno State. Today we honor Philip Levine, one of the most leading poetic voices of this generation, one that led to his appointment as the 18th U.S. Poet Laureate. He has had an enormous impact on the lives and careers of generations of poets, many of whom will be sharing their personal stories later in the program. We're proud that we had such a prominent faculty member at Fresno State, someone who is a true icon in the literary world. He truly helped our Fresno State community be put on the map. As you can tell, Philip Levine's legacy continues to play a vital role at our university. He was a man who spent his life being the first, even before he was first to give a voice in poetry to mid-20th century factory workers and others who labored to keep food on the table. First born in a set of identical twins to Russian Jewish immigrants. First in his family to earn a college degree at Wayne State in Detroit. First job out of college in the automotive industry, but he didn't stay. First job in academia at Fresno State, where he taught in the English department from 1958 until 1992. First book of poetry, On the Edge, published in 1963. First for Fresno State, earned by Professor Levine, included the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1973, the National Book Award in 1991 for What Work Is, the Pulitzer-Prize in Poetry in 1995 for The Simple Truth, and U.S. Poet Laureate in 2011 and 12, an honor now held by another Fresno State professor, Juan Felipe Kader. Though first to give a voice in poetry to mid-20th century factory workers, according to scholars, perhaps even closer to his idealistic young heart, were heroes of the Spanish Civil War, and the tomb of one he commemorates thus. For two, there are floral displays. But Estacio faces eternity with only a stone. Maybe as it should be, he was a stone and a blade. The first grinding and sharpening the other. We might see that Professor Philip Levine also is a stone. First, to sharpen all of us here at Fresno State. May his legacy of art, poetry, and humanity, and his respect for hard work live on in all of us. Thank you.
Say that we have suffered some attrition in our list. It's to be expected. The world always goes after poets. But Blossom Inada, David St. John, and Brian Turner were unable to attend. Because there are a fairly long list of speakers, we decided not to have introductions to each speaker, but we have bios of the speakers on pages 6 to 10, 6 to 8 in your hymnal. Everwine and I will be bookends, and then everybody else will come up alphabetically. And since 3 speakers couldn't make it, Chris Buckley, after his presentation, is going to read a poem of Phil's. In the summer of 1966, as I was preparing to graduate, Lily Alma, from a writer's workshop at the University of Iowa, I spent many desultory hours in the placement office, reading the ads for available teaching positions. Typically, these were jobs teaching 4 or 5 sections of freshman comp at places like Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, or Alamosa, Colorado, on the high plains down by the Oklahoma border, often the coldest place in America. Then one day, lo and behold, indeed, there was an ad from a place called Fresno State, and they were actually seeking a poet. I only later found out that Philip Levine and Peter Everwine had become among the most beloved teachers in the department, so why not take a shot at another poet? 3 poets in a department of between 15 to 20 faculty just couldn't have happened elsewhere in academia. I applied immediately. I arrived in Fresno in September and met Phil and Fran. Phil offered to drive me around town to look for an apartment. He arrived at my motel in a Jaguar sedan on loan from Russ Levenberg, the department chair, since Phil was awaiting delivery of the car. Without video, I can't capture the joy Phil got out of driving that Jag. Suffice it to say that he cackled every time his foot hit the gas. As we zoomed and careened around Fresno, I wondered if Phil had gone off his meds and was in a manic. It didn't take me long to figure out that Phil wasn't manic. He was just having a hell of a lot more fun than the rest of us. Take tennis, for example. As a young man, he loved the sport, and he took it seriously enough to have taken lessons. He had developed a tidy game with good volleying and serve that took a very pinky bounce and was difficult to return. His favorite part of the game by far, though, was trash talking. Man, was he good at trash talking. And he sometimes won points just because his opponent was doubled over in laughter and couldn't have a shot. On occasion, amid the hilarity, he would take a time out at the net to talk about a word. Does S-O-U-G-H rhyme with bow or buff? He used the poem in the word in that poem. So I said the former, he said the latter. Since both are acceptable pronunciations, that match was the only time I played it to a draw. Laughter and curiosity. Everyone who knew Phil knew how much those 2 things were a part of him. But everything that interested him, he pursued with a passionate intensity. If he had been a poker player, he would have been all in with every hand. That strategy doesn't work in poker, but it works very well in life itself. Phil, as a writer, worked harder than anyone else I knew, but he enjoyed everything he did more fully than anyone else I knew. A good meal was like a sacrament to him. Probably the word I heard him use most often was fantastic. The word could be applied to a bottle of wine, a poem, a jazz solo, whatever. It seems like a humble and shopworn word, especially now that Donald Trump thinks it applies to absolutely everything. But Phil used it in the old sense of the word. Something that was fantastic was beyond the facts or beyond reality. The great poet Theodore Roethke wrote, "I come once more to proclaim a condition of joy." Phil, too, conveyed a condition of joy because he approached life as something marvelous and beyond the facts, beyond reality. In fact, he took from life even more than it offered. His appetite for living whetted the appetites of everyone around him, and their lives became richer as a result. The New York Times critic Dwight Garner called Phil a moral comedian, which seems perfectly apt. Here's what I miss terribly. A group of friends not averse to the fruits of the vine, gathered around a dinner with the moral comedian at the head of the table. All of us laughing our heinies off. I tell you, that was fantastic.
Articles for his appointment as Laureate, the obituaries pointed only to this. But it is important to remember the poems of the Spanish Civil War, the lyric narratives cherishing family, translations from the Spanish, the incredible long poems throughout his career. No one, I mean absolutely no one, wrote as many inventive and brilliant long poems over 50 years. And finally, often overlooked are Phil's metaphysical poems. Those unique poems in which he forged a secular vision of hope for our spirits and our lives, which praised our collective being. But as grateful as we are for the singular body of work, we are even more grateful for the man. Our friend, comrade, father, husband, and mentor. There was no one more generous with his time, gifts, insight, experience. I was 28 when I came to teach at Fresno State. Friends had already won book awards, money prizes, and published in better journals. I was feeling a bit left behind in the dust with 3 early morning classes of composition. And then I received the most important poetry award of my life. I was assigned to share an office with Phil. For a couple of years, I sat at my desk correcting piles of papers, waiting for Phil to come in the afternoons, at which time I would throw up a question about a current poem or a poet or a journal, and my tutorials in poetry and life began. Phil gave great advice, not just about poetry, but about how to keep my head on straight through all the vicissitudes. His advice and care were essential in getting me through those early years. He emphasized the value of work for its own worth, patience, fortitude, modesty, dedication, and honesty. Phil wrote hundreds of letters by hand to me and many others. He wrote letters for me to the Guggenheim for over 20 years. And when I finally received the fellowship, I called Phil immediately to say I had good news for us both. I would not be asking for more letters. There are 4 anthologies of Phil's students who went on to publish and have careers in poetry. If you look around there's a wealth of talent in this room. So much so that perhaps some would have gone on to their accomplishments and careers without the inspiration and mentoring, the brilliant teaching and support of Phil. I certainly would not. There has been no one over the last half-century who has given more to students, to poets, and poetry than Phil. With scant exception, every one of us has a life in poetry, and hence a life, because we knew or studied with Phil Levine. The most notable name on that list of students, of course, was Larry Levis, the genius of his generation. When I was editing the University of Michigan Press book on the poetry of Philip Levine, Stranger to Nothing, I asked Larry to write an original essay for the collection. The result was Philip Levine, an essay which is the hallmark of the book, a remembrance of once hilarious in recalling Phil in the classroom in the 60s, and poignant in its tribute and testament to the value of great teachers. Speaking to Phil's generosity, how essential he was to all of our lives, Larry says it better than I ever can. To attempt to be at all objective about my friend and first teacher, Philip Levine, is impossible for me. For to have been a student in Levine's classes from the mid to late 1960s was to have a life, or what has turned out to be my life, given to me by another. It isn't enough to say that Levine was a brilliant young poet and teacher. Levine was amazing. His classes during those 4 years at Fresno State College were wonders, and they still suggest how much good someone might do in the world. For in any of those 50-minute periods, there was more passion, sense, hilarity, and feeling filling that classroom than anyone could have found anywhere in 1964. Whenever I tried to imagine the life I might have had I not met Levine, if he had never been my teacher, if we had not become friends and exchanged poems and hundreds of letters over the past 25 years, I can't imagine. I cannot see myself walking down one of those streets as a lawyer, or the boss of a packing ship, or even as the farmer my father wished I would become. And when I try to do this, no one's there. It seems instead that I simply had never been at all. All there is on that street, the leaves on the shade trees that line it, curled and black and closeted against noon heat, is a space where I am not. I'm going to conclude reading Phil's poem, Ascension. This is a broadside keepsake that will be passed out after the event today to all of you. We want to thank Tim Geiger at the Oriole Press for producing this for this event. Ascension. Now I see the stars are ready for me, and the light falls upon my shoulders evenly, rising through clouds and the lights of distant cities until the earth turns its darker side away. And I am ready to meet my guardians, or speak again the first words born in time. Instead, it is like that dream in which a friend leaves and you wait, parked by the side of the road that leads home, until you can feel your skin wrinkling and your hair grown long and tangling in the winds. And still you wait, because you've waited so long. Below, the earth has turned to light, but unlike the story Good in Paradise, I see no going and coming. None of the pain I would have suffered had I merely lived. At first, I can remember my wife, the immense depth of her eyes, and her smooth brow in morning light, the long, lithe body moving about her garden day after day, at ease in the light of those brutal summers. I can see my youngest son again moving with the slight swagger of the carpenter hitching up his belt of tools. I can even remember the feel of certain old shirts against my back and shoulders and how my arms ached after a day of work. Then I forget exhaustion, I forget love, forget the need to be a man, the need to speak the truth, to close my eyes and talk to someone distant but surely listening. Then I forget my own trees that evening, moving in the day's last heat, like the children of the wind. I forget the hunger for food, for belief, for love. I forget the fear of death, the fear of living forever. I forget my brother, my name, my own life. I have risen. Somewhere I am a God. Somewhere I am holy. I am a holy object. Somewhere I am.
I was 21 and had just served a 3-year enlistment in the Navy when I took my first class from Philip Levine. My only previous writing experience consisted of sports stories for the Santa Cruz Sentinel. I had a spotty academic record in high school, and there were others like me in Phil's classes, but he took us all seriously. Phil was the kind of teacher I'd never seen before. He'd come into a classroom, maybe tired, maybe irritated by some of the things he had to endure. And of course, he had flaws, the way we all do. But time after time, I saw this change come over him, full of grace or inspiration, whatever it was. And he'd speak with clarity and power. That seemed at those times that he was more than what he was. And to quote Phil, quote, he told the truth as it was given him to see the truth, no matter what. And you never knew what he might say in response to a student's work. I once wrote a poem that began, I love the dust, oil, and roar of German Tiger tanks pressing Europe with terror. I brought it to class, having written it out of my interest in military history. It was not focusing on the Nazis' horrific crimes against humanity. My fellow classmates thought I was going to really get it. But Phil said, this poem's honest. The Germans had those snappy uniforms, and France had a corrupt socialism that let the Spanish Republic die. Phil also defended our right to make aesthetic choices. I once wrote a poem in iambic pentameter quatrains with rhyme that the avant-garde students in the class did not like. Phil urged them, try listening to the poem, to its rhythm. He said this even though in his own work, he was beginning to move toward those free-verse poems using anaphora and parallel phrases, powerful poems that I would later teach and quote. Of course, his defense of my right to work within the formal tradition didn't keep Phil from critique. Years later, he once addressed a letter to me as Glover, I am Davis. Because of the quality of Phil's teaching, many of his students were admitted to the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, which in those days was the most distinguished program of its kind. There were 5 of us from Fresno State when I went there in 1964, more than any other university. Reflecting on our training under Phil, Harry Duncan, the great typographer, remarked that the Fresno poets were like Marines back from the South Pacific. because of my degree from Iowa and some poems that I'd revised and polished under Phil's guidance and published in the Southern Review and other places, I was able to get a teaching job at San Diego State. We had to teach 4 courses a semester in those years, and 2 of those courses would be English composition. One time in May, when the school year was over, I drove up to Fresno to see Phil. We drank the Spanish brandy for 3 days and 3 nights, washing out the kind of fatigue that comes from too much teaching. We talked about everything. It was a great 3 days. Fran would come in and with a slightly amused smile shake her head and go on about her business. At the end last year, I got to say goodbye to Phil. And tell him how much he meant to me. We spent a few minutes alone in the room where he lay, too weak to sit up. I told him my Mariana was a great wife, and he said, bring her in. We chatted for a couple of minutes. As Phil was upbeat, doing his best. Mariana mentioned that we just saw a documentary on Mel Brooks, and both of us were surprised how much he sounded like Phil. The same timing to his humor, and some of the same cadences that Phil had. I asked Phil, did you ever give Mel Brooks any pointers? Phil didn't miss a beat. Hell no! He never offered me enough money. It's fitting that my last memory of Phil is laughter. I miss him a lot.
Thanks to Dean Diaz, who invited me, to Connie, Peter, and beautiful Franny for inviting me to join you all this afternoon. I'm Kathy Fagan. A couple of weeks ago, I observed a class by a new colleague of mine at Ohio State, Marcus Jackson, a young African-American poet from Toledo who studied with Phil at NYU. He was teaching a handful of poems he called Poems with and Without Zip Codes. I don't know why I find that so charming, but I do. And one of the poems was Phil's soloing from toward the end of What Work Is. It's the poem about the John Coltrane dream that the elderly mother tells to her visiting adult son. He's driven over the grapevine with roses from Fresno in the back seat, and he almost didn't come at all. But there they are, thinking of Coltrane's music together in the heaven they both, separately, believed California would be. And there Marcus and I were, long ago and not so long ago students of Phil's, listening to a mutual student of ours read Phil's poem aloud, far from California, much closer to Detroit, in the frigid gray of a Columbus, Ohio winter. That's what it's like now for me. With Phil in neither New York or California, he's everywhere instead. In Piece of Music, a red carnation, a Lewis Hine photo, a classroom filled with his grand students. It seems to me only trauma, love, and art abide with us this way. And now I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Chris Buckley said from that wonderful Larry Levis essay. He wrote in his widely reprinted essay on Phil, whenever I try to imagine the life I might have had if I hadn't met Levine, I can't imagine it. That is, nothing at all appears. When I try to do this, no one's there. It seems instead that I simply had never been at all. In a Boston Review tribute to C.E. Wright, a line from a poem one of her former students, Lainey Brown, wrote for her goes, "You introduced me to the selves I had not yet met." I've been lucky to have written several pieces on film for Chris Buckley, for David Young at Field Magazine, most recently for Marie and Tomas's Love Fest of personal recollections coming close. But I wanted to share two very, very brief stories today about my first encounters with Phil that I haven't told before. Story one. I was a first-generation college student, and as part of my financial aid package here at Fresno State, I worked 20 hours a week in the library's reference department. My first semester of workshop with Phil, I'd see him in reference, or down the hall at Periodicals pretty often. I never greeted him because, of course, I assumed he didn't know who I was. And he never pushed it. But if our eyes met, he'd nod. If possible, I'd almost always try, after he left, to sneak a look at what he'd been reading. More than once, in my department, it was a bookshelf almost directly across from the reference desk, titled The Dictionary of Angels. I suspect Phil and I were the only people to look at it. I own my own copy now. Story two, same semester, first workshop with Phil. I'm 18, it's the late 70s. I don't fully understand workshop expectations. I stay mostly silent. I turn in very little. At some point, Mr. Levine, as I call him, warns me that I'm in danger of flunking the class. I'm a scholarship student. I say, "What can I do, Mr. Levine? I don't want to flunk the class." He says, "Come to my office and bring me everything you've written this semester," which I do, in longhand, in a spiral notebook. I had actually written a lot, but finished nearly none. He can see this as I sit terrified across from him. "I don't know what to do here," he says. "You're writing but not turning anything in. What do we do?" I'm silent. "What kind of grade do you think you deserve?" I don't know what to say. I've never been in a teacher's office, never mind a professor's, much less a poet's office before. I'm not a grade grubber, but I'm used to working hard and earning A's. I mutter something about how sorry I am I've disappointed him. Could I do extra credit to earn a C? And he says, "How about a B? Finish one of these poems, turn it in, and I'll give you a B." So things improved a lot after that. But to say Phil was my mentor is to wrongly revise my relationship with him. Mentorship implies teacher and student know what they're engaged in while they're engaging in it. And I, for one, had no idea. Phil to me was simply a funny, righteously angry, middle-aged guy who knew how to do what I wanted to do. He was capable of both acerbic overstatement and the most inanely tender observation. He possessed the no bullshit demeanor of a working man, the rigor of an artist, and the soul of a dreamer like his hero, Lorca. He spoke of angels without apology. He admiringly retold the jokes his wife made. He loved his cat but mourned the birds she killed. He wrote "no" in all caps with thick ink on a poem you'd labored over. To have these aspects of oneself mirror the attentiveness, passion, and compassion was to know oneself to be truly alive in his vivid presence. He was not always right, but he was honestly and fully there. He abides with us now in the squads of poets he left behind, who ministered to squads of younger poets. He abides with us in poems like Soloing, They Feed They Lion, You Can Have It, and hundreds more. He's left the Dictionary of Angels open on the table for us. It's filled with our names.
Normally, most of us don't talk about Phil Levine as being a subtle man, but I'm going to talk a little bit spring of 1992, the room was packed. The roster was full, and there were many unenrolled students begging to get in. Phil didn't over-enroll the class and make it too big and unwieldy to work, a mistake some of us have made way too many times. He also didn't refuse the extra students. He simply and quietly arranged to break the class into 2 workshops and taught the extra one along with the rest of his regular load. I never heard him complain about the overload once. I never even heard him mention it. I don't think many faculty members even knew he did it. But the students knew. And this is a student's story. It's actually Brian Turner's story. Brian couldn't be here today. But I've heard him talk about this many times. He was lucky enough to be in that second extra class, unscheduled, taught for free, without fanfare, by one of America's finest poets, who brought the same energy and passion and intensity to that extra course as he did to every single class he ever taught. I was not hired at Fresno State to teach poetry. There were 3 fantastic poets teaching here when I came along, and not that many poetry courses to rotate between them. I was hired as a generalist, as were many folks in our department in those days. I taught basic GE courses, Humanities, and American Lit courses. I was happy to have a job. I loved my students, and I was thrilled to be living and working among such a vital poetry community. I was not expecting to get a chance to teach poetry. So one semester, about a year or so after I'd been hired, I got my schedule and it listed a poetry workshop. I ran into the chair thinking he'd made a terrible mistake and should change it before anyone got upset. He said there was no mistake. He said Phil had asked to switch with me for that course, and that Phil would teach the GE course I'd originally been assigned. The chair also said that this had been a confidential request on Phil's part, and that I should just keep quiet, teach the course, and do it well. So I did my best. And from then on, I was included in the poetry rotation. Phil never brought it up, and neither did I. But I'm grateful to him every single time I walk into a workshop on that day, on that first day. Talking about poetry with the amazing students at Fresno State has been one of the great joys of my life. There were many of these subtle, behind-the-scenes actions of generosity on Phil's part that took place over the years, probably many that some of you know about, and certainly many, many more that only Phil knew about. I envy those of you who had Phil as a teacher. It was my good fortune to work with him and observe him as a colleague, to learn about teaching from one of the greatest poet teachers ever. What struck me the most, and still does, is Phil's high regard for his students as people. He may not have always told them what they wanted to hear. To be honest, he probably rarely told them what they wanted to hear. But he never talked down to them. He never condescended. I loved walking by his office in the hall and catching a glimpse of him in conference with a student, always leaning in, his entire focus on that student, intensely involved in conversation, and insisting by his passion and attention to it that poetry is worth all the time and energy we can bring to it. Often I'd see him walking across campus with a student or sitting on a bench engrossed in conversation about whatever was written on the piece of paper one of them was holding. And sometimes when he'd visit one of my classes or I'd visit his, I remember watching his hands as he looked at a workshop poem, one seeming to hold the sheet of paper down, the other marking up the poem, not making small editorial corrections, but moving more, I thought, like a designer or an architect, making squares around text, drawing arrows and lines, and writing his comments in those large, familiar, squared-off letters. And I remember his eyes when he looked up, eyebrows raised, the profoundly inquisitive look on his face. He'd ask students questions about the choices they had made. He'd ask students questions about details and authenticity. He'd ask who they were reading, and he'd listen intently to their answers. He talked about their work as work. He talked to them as maker to maker. But he wasn't all serious. He joked a lot, and he'd include himself as the butt of the joke as often as anyone else, which helped us all remember that we ought to take ourselves and our inflated poet egos much less seriously than we often do. It's tempting for a teacher to apologize for giving students bad news, to show pity, to hesitate, to use upbeat euphemisms. On the other hand, it can be equally easy to be dismissive or annoyed, or even to show a type of parental disapproval on the student's performance. All of this is a type of condescension, and that simply wasn't Phil's way. Once during an undergraduate workshop that Phil was visiting, a student raised his hand and asked, "Mr. Levine, do you consider poetry a serious hobby?" I thought the student was going to get punched or something. Phil was sitting, as he often did, leaning in, elbows resting on his knees, hands folded together. He was quiet for a long minute, staring at his own hands. Then, eyebrows raised above his glasses, he looked up, straight into the student's eyes, and said, almost gently, "No, I consider it a serious life." Phil offered students who were looking for it an authentic way to live in the world. He showed them that there was inherent dignity in making a poem out of the materials of your life. He didn't proselytize. He simply showed us every day what it looks like to put poetry at the very center of your life.
Hi, Fran. Well, this is exceedingly humbling to me. To be here in front of my teacher's child, Peter, and to not be a poet, but to be a reader of poetry. And I came to Fresno State in 1965 as a math major and was required to take an English course and met my first wife, who was still my wife, who said, "You ought to take this teacher, Philip Levine." So I enrolled in a poetry workshop, and I didn't know anything about poetry. And I remember the first class session, he asked about a dozen of us there, who were our favorite living poets. And I was terrified, because I didn't know any living, hardly any dead poets. And so I said, the only name that came to mind was popular at the time, and I said Rod McEwen. I knew this audience would appreciate it. Well, Phil didn't. He looked at me politely but sternly. He said, I said, "Poet." So I said the only other name that came to mind, which was Walt Whitman. So I said, "Walt Whitman." And he said, I said, "Living." So that was the beginning of my poetry education. And I thought when I left that first session that math was my future. But as it turned out, I became an English major and began to write poetry, but left going to law school, where I just completed a career in teaching law. The great wonder of this invitation was it led me to dig up the the letters that I had received, not quite hundreds, as Corinne mentioned, but scores, maybe 150 letters over the many years that I corresponded with Phil. And I decided, rather than boring with some of my reflections, capture him a bit by sharing with you some brief segments of a number of letters, most of them from the middle, late 60s, that I hadn't seen since they were received by me. These are 50-year-old letters. And the ones I want to start with, a few snippets, are remarkable because after I took a class or two, he took off to Spain with Franny and family, and I didn't know what I was going to do because I was sort of interested in poetry, and here he left me. So I said, "Could I send you some poems?" He said, "Sure." So here are a couple of, from 3 or 4, I'll just read them straight through, different letters. I won't tell you what he said about these poems. They're not, my mother would be embarrassed. Even though she's no longer alive, she'd be embarrassed. If you got an okay on one of his poems, or an okay plus, it was orgasmic. It was fabulous. Okay, here's Phil, the letter from Phil. Ah, you're a winner, Kader. You didn't waste a moment getting those poems off. You can't imagine how many people have asked me to read their work, and then when I said yeah, they never sent it. Perhaps it's a throwback to childhood, when one asked a question and expected to be denied. Let me talk about this poem right off, the poems right off. I'll probably be a little rougher on these poems than I would be if I saw them in class, where they would be surrounded by a lot of simpering, stupid cousins, or conventional old aunts wearing flowered hats. Another letter. These 2 poems, sometimes later, but still while I was in Spain. These 2 poems are the best I've seen by you. You've taken a great leap forward. You should be pleased as hell, man, but now you're going to law school, and you're suddenly becoming a true poet. Hanzlicek, he must be an awfully good teacher, but I have no doubt your stuff has taken a leap forward. A couple of years later, when I did go to law school at the University of Washington, I wanted to come see Phil, but was embarrassed, and so I wrote him I don't know what I wrote him. I can only imagine, given his responses. But here's one from probably 69 or 70. When he began to type letters, he would put the entire date, the year, but these early letters had month and date, but not the year. I'm sorry you didn't come by. I think it's natural that you should make a pilgrimage to an old teacher, poetry master. We all want to believe that these to be worshipped people really do exist. It makes life more significant, more hopeful. Maybe they do exist, but I ain't one of them. I'm a damn good poet, a damn good teacher, but I haven't got life up my sleeve. Shit, life has got me down its leg. Half the time I'm hanging on by my thumbs. I only know more than you because I'm twice your age and have been an adult 5 times as long. But I may have forgotten the only things that really matter. I may be 10 times as far from the source of my strength, my soul, my poetry. So no more pilgrimages to my house. I used to address all my letters to him as Professor Levine. So he wrote back again in the early 70s. This one I don't think from Spain, but I'm not certain. Listen, David, why don't you call me Phil? I know I'm old enough to be your Zelezny, but then you should have called him Phil too. Everyone called me by my first name. I don't even have a PhD. If you don't start calling me Bill, I'm going to call you Captain Kader. That advice, by the way, when I taught recently at Seattle University, summer course, students asked what they should call me. And I said, you can call me either Phil or Captain Kader. And most of the students call me Captain Kader. Here's a couple of reflections and letters he wrote me about teaching. Amigo, we go back to teaching, and this is a letter dated August 25th, so summer's over. Amigo, we go back to teaching in about a week. No, capital N-O. I'm not pleased by this prospect. I've been teaching on and off largely since 1955, and it's very hard to remain enthusiastic. I think it would do me good to be a municipal judge, maybe for a few years, and let one of those guys teach poetry. We'd both learn something anyway. January, following one of the best groups of beginning poets ever. All sorts of people, of all ages. The champs, maybe some of you will recognize yourself. The champs were a young Chicano, a 45-year-old housewife from Fig Garden, a huge bearded Okie painter, about 28, and a sweet little sophomore girl. Great variety of people, blacks, Chinese, a Protestant minister, a few heads. I think I don't think. And several of them even worked like mad. It was a marvelous class. It was hard to bid farewell. The following year, I think maybe 71, it sounds as though you're really going to be a lawyer. Why not? I say to myself, I wish I'd become a lawyer instead of a teacher. But then I say that only because a new semester is dawning. And I'm not delighted to be back at work. Or maybe it's just to be back at Fresno State where all is overcast with gloom. I think it's the same story everywhere. The fascists coming down hard. And as a teacher, you feel so powerless, and you don't exactly feel like a Superman as a poet either. But one has got to fight through the hard times and the defeats, or one isn't worthy of whatever small victories come in a lifetime. Let me conclude with some more recent. One is from 1992 and one is from 2005. Allen Ginsberg recently died, a few other poets. So I wrote him about, I'd just been to Europe, and there were all these sites of pilgrimage for famous writers and poets. He didn't seem to be in the States, so I must have written him about that, because he says, no, I don't think there would ever be a shrine to an American poet, certainly not one visited by any. People do go to Whitman's place in Camden, but his house on Long Island was torn down, and as Larry Levis writes, they put up a Walt Whitman Mall in its place. I'm going to go visit that sometime. The last passage from a letter through it. My father had died, and I guess I had written him a letter about grieving, and he wrote back as follows. I think once we get to a certain age, our lives can tip in the direction of grief, and there's nothing we can do about it. I personally pray to outlive my children and their children, but then I'm asking them to deal with my death. I know I couldn't deal with theirs. But I try not to complain in my heart, nor should you, for life is pretty damn good, and we know it.
Thanks to everybody who put this on, who did a lot of hard work and really make it easy. My name is Dixie Salazar, and I was a student of Hales. What is required of a poet is to live fully and morally. These words quoted from Bill's The Essential Keats apply to Bill himself. He most surely lived, loved, and wrote fully and certainly morally. I probably took 3, maybe even 4 classes with Bill over the years. I had become addicted to poetry, and then my addiction grew to include Bill's classes. I wish I remembered more stories from those classes, but what I do remember is the overall feeling of excitement and being fully engaged, like the things that were said in his class really mattered. I was hungry for poetry in those days, and I always knew I would come away from his classes sated, as if from a feast of wisdom and poetic truths. And we all gobbled up every morsel. After each class, I felt like I was discovering poetry all over again. I had other poetry teachers over the years who gave out truckloads of information. All poetry masters, Brodsky, Richard Howard, William Matthews. But what was so different about Phil's class, I've been asking myself. I guess I would have to say that what I learned wasn't just confined to poetry. I learned something essential and true about life. And that's what Phil demanded from our poems, honest substance and truth. Yes, he was tough, but I can see now that this was a remarkable gift to us. Not to demand less would have been an insult to poetry and to us. When he said to me after my last class with him, "Yes, you can be a poet," I felt like he handed me my driver's license. He'd already given me the roadmap and I knew that I needed to study the rules of the road more, but now I was ready to roll. When Galway Cannell spoke of Walt Whitman's poetry as a cosmic song attached to the creatures and things of the world, he could have been describing Phil's poetry. And like Whitman, Phil's poetry gives the reader the sense that they are always included. Yehuda Amichai said about poetry, the main thing is to be useful. This can be applied without reservation to Phil's poetry and also to his life. He was enormously generous, writing letters of recommendation and support so often that it's a wonder he had time to write some poetry. One of the last things he did was sign a petition for me to save the Fulton Mall, just weeks before his death. He said the mayor's idea of tearing it up for a road was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of. Phil didn't hold back when it came to causes he felt strongly about, and he didn't kowtow to those in power. It was late in the day when he was awarded the key to the city by the mayor after he won the Pulitzer-Prize, and he said when he accepted, "Now she gives me the key, there's only 3 hours left." But a huge part of what Phil was and what he became includes Franny. And Phil knew it. He joked once and said the secret was out, that Franny had written all his poems. Of course, she may not have written his poems, but she was the ink, the protoplasm, the life force that flowed through it all. Their home is unassuming and modest, but full of simple truths and always, always love and warmth. I'm still hoping to grow up someday and be like Franny. Kind, loving, smart, generous, and always full of laughter. Like Phil said in his book on the essential Keats, the legacy of Keats is threefold: poetry, the letters, and the brave, honest, exemplary life. These words apply to Phil as well. From Song of Myself. To me, the converging objects of the universe perpetually flow. All are written to me, and I must get what that writing means. And I know I am deathless. So is Phil deathless, still here among us today and afterward, in our ears and in our hearts. I'll end with Phil's words, from Dust and Memory. The wind that swirled the sand that day years ago had a name that will outlast mine by 1,000 years. Though made of air, which is what I too shall become, hopefully, air that says quietly in our ear, I'm dust and memory, your two neighbors on this cold star. That wind, the Levante, will howl through the sockets of my skull to make a peculiar music. When you hear it, remember it's me singing, gone but here, warm still in the fire of your care.
Does anybody have any extra Kleenex? Up? Okay. About 3 years ago, my name is John Veinberg. 3 meetings ago, Phil comes up to me, he has a glass of wine in his hand, and says, "Hey, I got something for you." So I reach for the wine. He says, no, you buy your own. He says, "Wait till afterwards, after the reading." He gives me a package. Inside that package I was doing, and I was afraid to look at it. to the side, you know, I'm not going to look over here, but I was afraid, not that he's going to do anything, I mean, it wasn't that bad. But I was afraid I was going to see, I don't know, the raging eyes of Charles Manson or something. I thought he was going to do it, but it wasn't like that at all. And as luck would have it, I had a poem on the sheet that day. And guess what? I ruined his fucking dinner. Oh my goodness. I don't know what happened, when it happened, how it happened. But Philip Levine taught me how to live inside the poem. Inside that poem, a world existed, both dark and beautiful. A world much greater than oneself and much more graceful. Phil came up and said, I think you belong here, in this world, among the music of words. Here, I'll open the door. I'll help you. And by God, he did. Let me read a little of that essay that I wrote when I have my jacket on. I can't see the page. I don't know if Phil ever believed in magic, but I do know he took a group of us who at one time or another gazed at the August stars, heard car crashes from their apartment patios, and in winter immersed themselves between the fleece of tule fog, and in summer were scoured by heat in their backyards and corrupted by the swirling dust spores of valley fever. Philip Levine taught us how to laugh at ourselves, how to respect poetry by spending our time to let the silence enter us. And just maybe, we might hear the furious beating heart of childhood, or get a glimpse of the thread of light wiggling beneath the moth's wing. Watch it as it ignites into a wheel of fire, so bright and beautiful and bold, and so deeply touches the human spirit. I am inadequate to call anything but magic.
I'm Liza Weiland. Thank you to Chuck and inviting me back. So, what Shakespeare taught us 100 million years ago when we were in high school is that the poem makes the poet immortal. Hard to swallow sometimes. Oh, really, you say? Well, yeah, really. The proof is that right now in North Carolina, a certain 16-year-old, who most of you here helped to raise, said this recently when her mother opened a clever and amusing gift from Franny. She said, "Mom, you just squealed like a housewife discovering television." You know that poem. This same 16-year-old still believes with all her heart the last 3 lines of
Robert Frost's stopping by woods on a snowy evening are, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. No, not this pig. She believes the same is true of several different poems by Emily Dickinson. She's surprised every time she hears or reads these poems and the last line is missing. She says she adds it unconsciously, like breathing. What she also remembers is Phil and Franny as landlord, a memory shared by lots of us who were the beneficiaries of this particular generosity. For all the writers who stayed there over the years, colleagues and graduate students, new and old, sometimes people they'd never met. It was heaven. Franny's yard, her garden, the jazz tapes and CDs, the study with all those annotated books, which will now be here in the beautiful reading room. And sometimes for the lucky renters, there was even a long-distance education in line, like a stock tip. Phil's voice on the phone from New York, Wolf Glass Shiraz. There's a guy I know says it's at Trader Joe's. Go get a couple cases. Try a bottle and tell me what you think. And we did. And this same 16-year-old told me yesterday afternoon, so I had to rewrite this whole thing, what she thinks of Phil, when she thinks of Phil, she thinks of 4 years ago, when Phil came to North Carolina to read, and she walked in from school from the distinct mortality of 7th grade. And he was sitting at the dining room table eating an apple, and she had never seen him in our house, and he looked so comfortable and so out of context. So comfortable and so out of context. To be squarely in the world and to stand outside of it at the same time. Isn't that exactly what we love about the people in Phil's poems? What we love about Phil, and still do, and always will.
I'd like to thank Fresno State for organizing this event, Chuck and Connie and everybody for him. I want to bring greetings from a couple of people who are very far away, who would love to have been here today, and who are in other ways. First, to David Oliveira, with Chris Buckley and I, we put together How Much You're. David says, I remember Phil literally a bit every day, mostly by thinking about a poem or being grateful for a moment of his generosity. He was generous with his criticism, without doubt, and generous with his talent, his kindness, his caring, generous with the gift of his life. And also from Loretta Collins Clova, who's in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Philip Levine made me feel that there was a place in poetry for my working class experiences and my connection to the cultural mix and beauty of the San Joaquin Valley. He was a tough but generous mentor. His poems are tough and full of love. Walt Whitman said, all goes onward and outward, nothing collapses. I believe this. Philip Levine continues in what he has offered up to us, and we take it up because whether the matchless example of his poetry, whether the depth and passion of his teaching, whether his insistent ethos dedicated to social justice and the dignity that should be accorded to all people, we take it up because he impressed upon us a responsibility to poetry and what it could do to make a vision of how we could be better. A great poem is a profound accomplishment, and Phil's many great poems continue to make the world better in the face of so many impoverishing forces. And we have to take up the work. We have to pass it on, onward and outward. David and Loretta both touched on Phil's kindness and generosity, something we've all experienced. He did so much for us. He even came and talked to my high school students when I would talk at Fresno High. I'd offered him a bottle of Cabernet. It came as special selection I found for him to do this. In his office here on campus, I once remarked on his kindness, thanking him for having helped me so many times during my time at Fresno State. He looked me in the eye and said, "Do me a favor, don't tell anybody." But he had this reputation. He was a little bit proud of this reputation of being a hard ass, a boxer in the Navy, and his first punch was his honesty. A kindness that could open a cut, yes, but a true kindness, and the foundation for so much. His generosity, which always is one of the first words you hear from people who knew him, and had something he shared with Franny. I think he would say because of Franny, who welcomed all of us and loved us despite the tendency of some of us to show up on their porch unannounced and knock on the door. It opened. Kindness that comes from honesty makes families, and here we all are, the family he and Franny and their children made together, and his poetry family that keeps growing as Phil's lessons and his poetry and his love for what's right continue to do their work in the world. I'm going to finish with a couple poems, one that I wrote after an afternoon with Peter in his backyard last April. And then I'd like to finish with one of Phil's. The poem's called Calliope's. In your backyard, mulberry tree in full summer shag, vines up a lattice beside the table. We sip wine, speak of your lost best friend, Phil. It was hard, all you could say. The cancer, what it took from your heart, from his last days, from all of us. In the silence that must follow, 2 hummingbirds zoom from the tree, sip red syrup from a feeder, zip back into the shag. Calliope's, 2 you point, noting the green back, the purple-red beard, your tired voice delighted now. I thought there was only one. 2 muses, I laugh, beautiful. 2 you say, watching and you smile. Again, a funny story about Phil. And this one, it's not one of his most famous poems, but I read it and I loved it, and it's spring, and baseball starts next week, and Phil loved jazz. And I love it because it ends in a time when it never should have been this dark, but it's optimistic, and I loved it when I read it the other day. It's called Standing on the Corner. It's in Names of the Lost. Until Tatum passed, blind as to see, heavy, tottering on the arm of the young bass player, and they both talking Jackie Robinson. It was cold, late, and the flame show bar was crashing for the night. Even Johnny Ray calling it quits. Tatum said, "Can't believe how fast he is to first. Wait till you see Mays," the bass player said. Women in white furs spilled out of the bars and trickled toward the parking lot. Now it could rain. Coming straight down, the man in the brown hat never turned his head up. The gutters swirled their heavy waters. The streets reflected the sky, which was nothing. Tatum stamped on toward the Bland Hotel. A wet newspaper stuck to his shoe, his mouth open, his vest drawn and darkening. "I can't hardly wait," he said.
I've been listening to the
do that. You by now have, sure in some sense, the abundance that made up Philippine. Funny stories, sad stories, teaching. The value of being an old geezer now, like me, is that I met Phil in 1956, 7. We became friends. You must understand how fortunate and privileged I feel to have spent over 5 decades close to that man in many ways. Friends, colleagues, companions, brothers, the shared experience, writing poetry and the sense of things. He helped me, without question, to be a better poet. And he helped me to see more deeply into the human spirit, not only my own, but others. I lived a very fortunate life that way. And so I'm grateful to him. I'm grateful to his family, who welcomed me to their circle and were kind enough, at least not in my hearing, to never say that I was a shameless moocher. Which of course is quite true. Someone mentioned that Phil liked to write long poems, he did. And every now and then, I would dig him a little bit and suggest that he, when he was sending to a magazine that paid handsomely by the line, that he shortened his line a little bit and stretched the poem out. And he would do that kind of squint-eye thing of his and smile at me and go from there. I, on the other hand, prefer to write short poems. And so when I sent the magazines that paid by the line, I tried to pad things by counting the value of the year's free subscription that the magazine gave us, which was often more than I got for writing the lines of the poem. So I'm going to read a relatively short poem, which I think summarizes a great deal of what's been going on. And that's the value of coming at the end of things. It's like a good teacher. He lets his students do all the work. Philip Levine, 1928, 2015. In your letters to me, you signed yourself Nellie, the name you'd given to a cat you'd favored. Touching, I thought. You, such fondness for a cat. But I think you may have fooled me, friend, and named the two of you after Nellie Fox, the White Sox Hall of Famer. Although the fox you meant was a spirit animal
Penny, kindred to the seer and the seen, sly trickster, clown. You had a painting of one in your study. As you worked, it kept watch with you until you looked up from the words you had found. Time turned. Animals, as you said, are passing from our lives. And though it's of your quick spirit and passing when I speak, it seems fitting that I think of you now as a fox hard-tailing through a stubble field. At your heels, a pack of loud-mouthed hounds and hunters decked out in their stylish uniforms. You running just fast enough to let them think they have a chance with you. Then, game weary of their brass announcements and theatrical airs, you slip into the gathering shadows of the woods, laughing your ass off.
I'm Vida Samiian. I served as Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities from 2004 to 2014. And worked with Phil more closely in the last few years when he was appointed U.S. Laureate. We know that Phil was not a fan of administrators. Fortunately for me, he had softened up and was generous in accepting my friendship. The first time I met Phil Levine was on the occasion of his retirement at the annual banquet of the college. Phil talked about what teaching meant to him. A reciprocal and in some way organic interaction between student and teacher, which goes beyond the boundaries of the classroom, transcending the dimensions of space and time. A sort of suspended and continuing connection beyond all boundaries, as if floating in space and timelessness. The image resonated and hung in my memory, but I only fully understood its meaning years later as I observed Phil with his former students, like today, when we celebrated his appointment as U.S. Poet Laureate. Over the years, Phil was very generous with his time and teaching. He offered workshops for the MFA students and participated in summer arts. He remained actively involved in an inclusive way as a mentor to the Fresno Poets Association and the community of Fresno writers. Phil's death leaves an irreplaceable void, but he will live through his words for all of us and for those who know his work. Let me share 2 ways that Phil will continue to live at the university in the MFA program. The first is the Philip Levine Poetry Book Prize, which was established in 2001 through the efforts of Connie Hales and other colleagues in the program. Levine Book Prize has become a very successful national book contest, attracting hundreds of entries. This year we received a record-breaking 945 full-length book manuscript. The MFA program runs the contest as part of a graduate course, giving students hands-on training and experience in the world of publishing and editing. The contest has just named its 13th winner, judged by Chuck Hanzlicek. The winner receives a $2,000 prize, and the winning book is published by Ahimsa Press. The second is the Philip Levine Scholarship that the MFA program established in his name and is awarded to one student each year. But no endowment had been established to generate the scholarship annually, which brings me to the story I want to share with you. During the last few years, in celebration of Phil's appointment as Lewis Poet Laureate, we held a number of events and decided to do a special edition of a wine at the University Winery. I'm sure you all tasted that wine. Phil was very generous with his time. He and Franny met with the graphic design students. With Peter's help, Phil blended and selected the wine, and it indeed became the most popular wine. It is sold out now. There were 2 festivals published with essays and poems from former students and friends, both testimony to Phil's connection with his students. One of them, First Light, edited by Christopher Buckley, was published collaboratively with the press at CSUF at Fresno State. The press is housed in the College of Arts and Humanities. Phil kindly agreed for us to use the proceeds from the wine and the festival to build the Phil Levine Scholarship Endowment. But we still had not reached the endowment level. In 2013, I asked Phil for yet another favor. If he would be willing to do a summer workshop for the MFA students. And he agreed with the concept. Of course, some of our faculty wanted to attend the workshop as well, but Phil said no, the student experience will not be the same with faculty in attendance. This was the last workshop that Phil offered. So let me close with Phil's words by sharing 2 emails that Phil sent me as he conceptualized the workshop. I think these emails reveal Phil's approach and commitment to teaching and students. On January 26, 2013, he wrote, "Dear Vida, having given our proposals some thought, I have decided to do something else, something I have not done before, and not what I've done so many times. I will mull this over in my mind, and as soon as I've decided, I'll let you know. It won't take long. Yes, I do want to do something to be useful, but teaching what I so often taught has little appeal for me. I will be in touch shortly." Then on February 4th, he wrote, "Dear Vida, for this coming summer, I have designed a course that I believe I would enjoy. There will be no fees for the students, as well as no credits for grading. In fact, it would not be a course. It would be made up entirely of 3 conversations on a single book, which the 15 students, if we can call them students, would all read. There would be 3 meetings of an hour or more each. I would receive no stipend. Instead, the School of Arts and Humanities could contribute what it can afford to the scholarship that bears my name. The book I've chosen for this offering is Now All Roads Lead to France by Matthew Hales. It deals with the last 5 years of the life of the English poet Edward Thomas. He died at age 39 in World War I. His mentor was the American poet Robert Frost. The book deals cogently with several significant themes: friendship, mentoring, marriage, the life of the artist, patriotism, love, war, and more. I hope this will please you. Well, the scholarship did reach endowment level. This year's recipient is Angela Corbett as our Phil Levine Fellow in the MFA program. We are grateful to Phil and Franny for making this possible. Thank you.
Joe Diaz couldn't make it, and I will attempt to fill in his place. I'd like to speak to you about a very special event that is happening in Fresno State. It's the Phil Levine Reading Room at the library, second floor. It overlooks the Peace Garden. It's very fitting for him. And this is due in part to the generosity of our Provost, Zelezny, to whom we went at the beginning with the idea. And it started with generosity, really. The generosity of Brown Levine, who was willing to donate to Fresno State, not to New York, not to anywhere else, but to Fresno State, over 2,000 books of Phil Levine, annotated books, where the essence of Phil can be found, where the spirit of Phil's thoughts are throughout, and also where you as a community member, where you as a student, you as a professor at Fresno State can go and just explore and just write. It's a room of our own, to quote Virginia Woolf. A room in which poetry can be created, in which dialogue can be established, and in which we can discuss the humanity that binds us, the beauty of our valley, that incredible notion that Phil left with us, the legacy of a sense of our own, of who we are, Fresno. That's an incredible thought. He actually made us aware that we live in a good city. We live in a good valley, a valley that feeds the world, a valley of hardworking people. In the summer, it's really hot, and sometimes you feel a little bit of the air that has the salt. Remember that poem? It's that valley, it's that notion of being that he left with us. And it is that legacy of Phil Levine that is going to be in this shrine, to go back to David. It is a shrine, but it's a living shrine. It is not a stagnant sort of space. It is dynamic, it is full of life. It is a space in which future generations will go and discover Phil, and then they themselves will create their own poetry. They themselves will be inspired by our valley, our workers, our fruit, our university. So this space is thanks to, again, the generosity of Fran Levine, the generosity and vision of our Provost, Lynnette Zelezny, Debbie A. Stone as well, Peter McDonald, the Dean of the Library, and you will see right now the rendition of the space made by Clegg. You see this. You see the photograph in the background. It'll have some of his personal objects, and it'll have all of his library on the side, the chairs. It's a living, again, space for us to enjoy. The creation and permanency of the Phil Levine Reading Room is all through private support. And it'll be located on the second floor overlooking, again, our beautiful Peace Garden. This will be then the legacy that we have here at Fresno State. It is a treasure for us. It is a treasure for you. It's a treasure for the community as well. Thank you for coming. Please stay around. We have one last performance, which I think will be an incredible fitting tribute to Phil Levine. And after the performance, please join us in the adjacent room to drink and eat and laugh and remember Phil Levine.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Boone. I'm a composer and a saxophonist and a professor of music here at Fresno State. And I was asked to close out this program by speaking just a little bit about my collaboration with Phil and by playing a couple of tracks from our collaboration so that the end of this will be Phil's voice and Phil's words. All of you know what a fabulous jazz fan he was. He was a walking encyclopedia of personal stories about various people. And when he told me who some of his teachers were at high school and who some of his classmates were, like Kenny Burrell, it just blew me away. So let me start by saying that I'm actually at Fresno State because of Philip Levine. When I saw the job listing, you can probably tell from my accent, I was sitting in a cafe in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a writer friend, Danny Folks-Gray. I casually asked Danny if he knew anything about Cal State Fresno, and he got really excited. He said, wow, this is where my all-time favorite poet, Phil Levine, teaches, so it's got to be a great place. You've got to check this place out. And so I did, and here I am. Right? What Danny didn't tell me is that Philip had retired, and so. And I should note that Danny's wife actually is an identical twin, and there was a famous news report where her sister was murdered at an abortion clinic in Boston, and Dorothy received a book from Phil signed to another identical twin. So I thought I'd share that with you. Anyway, over the course of the last few years, I had the honor of collaborating with Phil, melding his poetry with music, and it's been one of the highlights of my creative life. It started with a fundraiser for Fresno Filmworks, which Dixie did, and it went really, really, really well. In fact, it was really magical in spite of the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that Philip didn't show up for the rehearsal. In fact, the program started without Phil, and we were running around. If you remember, we didn't know whether to change the order or anything. So I was backstage trying to do deep breathing exercises. But I learned that this was part of Phil's pedagogical approach, at least with me, to trust that things are going to work out. He actually said once to me when I get a little bit anxious, I'm a free improviser, but I like to at least know when I'm going to go on stage. And he actually said once, when I said, well, great, you're going to do this concert, and we've decided these poems. Let's run through it once with the band. What do you think? And he said, what could go wrong? And of course, in my mind, I had a very long list that was going down, but I was smart enough to keep my mouth shut in vain security. Right? Well, we ended up recording 29 of his poems. You've mentioned several of them, including the Sowing and the Feed They Lion and Clifford. I can't remember the other ones you've mentioned. And a few of them you might not even know about because he never had read them in public. He said that they needed music. So, and I think a couple that maybe now have been published but weren't before. As the project expanded and grew in scope, several jazz greats like Branford Marsalis and Chris Potter ended up doing recording with, on top of the local musicians, and a lot of them were affiliated with Fresno State. Phil's reading was so musical, his timing was so precise, and his voice so meshed with the music that we rarely had to do more than one take. It was almost like he was a member of the band. As we musicians say, he had really big ears. And I've heard some of you say that in another way. But he not only loved jazz, he really was, when he was with us, as you'll hear, I hope, he really was a jazz musician, not just a jazz fan. He was, in your words, fantastic. So in addition to these 29 jazz things that we did, with Franny's permission, I took some of those narration tracks and used that in an orchestra piece that was performed at Disney Hall called Waterless Music. If you want to Google that sometime. Before playing the tracks, I'd like to read what I read at Philip's birthday celebration a few years ago, because I think that it's even more relevant for me today. I said, "Dear Philip, collaborating with you on our CD project and in concert has been a highlight of my career. By example and through your words, you have taught me much more than you might imagine. To look under the surface, to see with fresh and clear eyes, to be artistically honest, to find newness and be invigorated by it, to look life in the eye and to accept disappointment and darkness, and to hear music as poetry and poetry as music. You've given me tremendous encouragement and confidence, and I relish the opportunity to grow and learn even more from you. I am so glad that you were born." The first track we'll hear is Our Ballad that the Dean was speaking about. It's on the CD that next week, actually, the demo is being produced and I'm going to get it, and it's going out to Blue Note and Universal and Sony, and we'll see if anybody bites. The second one isn't on the CD and hasn't even been mastered. It has wrinkles, it has blemishes, it has words, and I confess it has an out-of-tune saxophone player. But I think it's an appropriate track to end this program. It's called Let Me Begin Again.
See the ocean, not ever. But in July and August, when the worst heat seems to rise from the hard clay of this valley, you could be walking through a fig orchard, when suddenly the wind cools, and from all you get a whiff of salt, and in that moment, you can almost believe something is waiting beyond the Pacheco Pass. Something massive, irrational, and so powerful, even the mountains that rise easily have no worth. You probably think I'm nuts, saying the mountains have no word for ocean. But if you live here, you begin to believe they know everything. They maintain that huge silence we think of as divine. The silence that grows in autumn when snow falls slowly between the pines, and the wind dies to less than a whisper, and you can barely catch your breath because you're thrilled and terrified. You have to remember, this isn't your land. It belongs to no one, like the sea you once lived beside and thought was yours. Remember the small boats that bobbed out as the waves rode in, and the men who carved a living from it, only to find themselves carved down to nothing. Now you say this is home. So go ahead, worship the mountains as they dissolve in dust. Wait on the wind, catch a scent of salt, call it our life. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a speck of dust caught in the night winds, sweeping out to sea. Let me begin this time knowing the world is salt and dark clouds. The world is grinding and sighing all night, and dawn comes slowly and changes nothing. Let me go back to land after a lifetime of going nowhere. This time lodged in the feathers of some scavenging gull, white above the black ship that docks and broods upon the oily waters of your harbor. This leaking freighter has brought a hold full of hay for us from Spain. Great Jeroboams of dark Algerian wine and quill pens that can't write English. The sailors have stumbled off toward the bars or the bright houses. The captain closes his log and falls asleep. 1:10:28. Tonight I shall enter my life after being at sea for ages, quiet, in a hospital named for an automobile. The one child of millions of children was flown alone by the stars above the black wastes of moonless waters that stretched forever. Was turned golden in the full sun of the noonday. A tiny, wise child who this time will love his life because it is like no other.
Please join us in the jazz room.
I'd like to propose a toast. First, I'd like to thank you for coming. And I'd like to thank everyone who made this special day a reality. The MFA program, Joe Diaz, who was integral in all of this as well. University Communications, the Music Department, KFSR, our own development, Munja and Becky and all of her staff. The administration, the president, the provost whom you met earlier, and then of course the Levine family, Fran especially. So the toast is the following. I'd like to toast to a moment in which Phil was born, a moment in which Phil met Fran, a moment in which Phil and Fran moved to Fresno, and a moment in which they both made this their home. So here's to them. Thanks for coming.